Aloha everybody, good morning. My name is Karim Khan. Welcome to History 241, Civilization of Asia, Part 1. Today we are going to be starting Session 3, which deals with the Prehistoric Asia. But let's talk about first a few housekeeping items. Number one, please go to WebCT and check the course assignments if there are any. Pay attention to the details in the course section of the presentation. Also see if there are any assignments. Please email me if you have any difficulties, any problems, or you can call my office and leave your message there. At the same time, tell me that you are, when you leave your message, tell me that you are from my History 241 class. That's not to confuse you with other students. Once again, my name is Abdul Karim Khan, and I teach here at Leeward Community College, and welcome to History 241, Civilizations of Asia, Part 1. In today's presentation, before we get into that, let's see what we did last time in Session 2. So this is going to be a bit review. We talked about the Asian countries, the peoples. We identified different Asian countries by their areas, East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and the peoples that inhabit those countries. We also talked about the monsoon agriculture, the torrential rains, and how monsoon agriculture has its own impact on the natural environment, the geographical and natural environment, and again, how the geography and the nature of Asia creates the culture on the ground and what impact it has on the people of Asia and the different communities that live in different parts of Asia, North Asia, South Asia, West Asia, or Southeast Asia, or East Asia. So we talked all about that, the different communities, the different people, how they create their, communities, villages, their families, especially the extended families and the hierarchies that we see in the families, how the families are ruled or organized or managed across gender as well as age level. We also talked about the patriarchal societies. Most of Asia is patriarchal, we saw that. Some places like in Southeast Asia, especially in Philippines and other places, we talked about the patriarchal societies as well as the matriarchal societies. We also talked about the villages and how they create their own help networks and how people in villages, they help each other, and the utility of village as an organization, as a social unit. So today we are going to focus on the prehistoric Asia, that is the Asia before the writing documents started in Asia. So it's going to be much more based on archaeological evidence. Later on we will talk about the written records, but right now keep in mind one thing, that for every evidence, cultural or historical evidence, we do not have to have writing, the alphabets especially. Writing or record in archaeological evidence can be as such as a painting, rock or a cave painting, or somebody wrote something on the wall to communicate some idea. So there is a lot of that stuff, around the world. So then again, do not emphasize on the existence of writing in a particular culture when we are talking about the prehistoric or the pre-writing period in a culture. So in Asia, you have to wait for the Chinese to come up with their own writing. Before that, entire Asia, or especially Southeast Asia, did not have a writing script. So we would do, based on the archaeological hard finding of the pottery, the utensils, the implements, the form implements, the tools, the weapons that experts have found there. So from there we construct the history of Asia. So one more time, prehistoric times are those times that are written, those were without writing. So we focus much more on the physical evidence. So let's see how in this presentation, today's presentation, that's the session 3, what we are going to be talking about. Prehistoric Asia, that's Asia before the written records. We would also talk about the rise of humanity in Asia. Where did they, come from, and how they started their life. We would also talk about the racial differences, the similarities among different communities and regional groups in Asia. We will also talk about the rise of Neolithic agriculture in Asia, and where did it start, and why, especially why in some places and not in other places. So that would be sort of the overall scheme of things. We would also talk about the transition or exchange of crops within Asia. Much more the Southeast Asian diffusion into Northeastern Chinese regional area. How people moved around and how commodities and products went from one point to another point, one region to another region in Asia. And we will also talk about the Chinese influences on Korea and Japan. So that's a sort of introduction. One more time, keep in mind that the evidence would be much more physical. It'd be much more that we can see it in shape of the tools, the implements, the weapons, but not so much in writing. So that's why the whole session is titled the Prehistoric Asia, that is Asia before writing. So let's go into the presentation itself. The Prehistoric Asia, how early human beings started in Asia. Now we notice in the last presentation that human beings, they originated in Africa. And from there, they immigrated in different directions. But most of them immigrated very successfully to the Asian part, closer to Africa. So out of Africa and into Asia, and there inside Asia, why human beings, close to around 1.5 million years ago, the Homo erectus that we find in Asia. Now, there in we go between Africa and Asia. Now, in Africa, we know that's the birthplace of human civilization, human existence. Human beings started in Asia, we know that. Although there are people, who because of some racial problems or ethnic problems, they might, dispute that claim, but that's up to them. But the scientific theory is that human beings started in Africa. Africa is the birthplace of humans. Even if those people who, both the people who take the Darwinist theory of evolution and those who take the creation theory of Bible, even for the people who believe in Bible, in the book of Genesis, and I told you that every nation, they have their own sort of, creation story. Previously I told that. If you pick Bible, and some people believe that yes, if there was Adam and Eve, and if they had to be in some place, so that place could be most probably Africa at that time, because it could provide people sort of, existence better than other places, especially East Africa, Northeast Africa, what is called the African Ridge. And so even people who take a Bible, the story of Genesis to be the beginning point for Adam and Eve and the human race, they say, yeah, we can live with that story that human beings started in Africa. So we here in the presentation take no sides with anyone, but I should warn you that when we go into the dating system, who started where and when, definitely by that definition, by that token, the story is much more on the line of the theory of evolution, which does not so much contrast, the biblical story also, because there is no dating system in the Bible. So let's get out of there and focus on the the rise of human beings in the shape of Homo erectus in Asia, and the period is somewhere around 1.5 million years back. Human beings lived in the shape or size of Homo erectus, and there in Indonesia, in a place Java, experts found a human being, a skull of a human being, and which is now called as a Java man. That person has been identified as and named as Java man, and he is known as a Homo erectus, or a person that belonged to the Homo erectus. Another person in Asia called the Peking man, he was found, or the skull was found in China, and both belong to that 1.5 million years back, the Homo erectus period in Asia. Now, what that suggests, human beings lived by this time 1.5 million years. They lived almost everywhere, and especially in Asia. And the reason for that is very clear, that human beings found a better place in Asia. That's, and that's a very common sense things to say, and very logical. 1.3 million years ago in Asia, then you see the rise of Homo sapiens, which also suggests the very successful development of human race in Asia. And why Asia? Because, as we know, better environmental conditions in Asia that you had, the naturally sustainable food supplies that we have in Asia compared to any other place. So that's why the rise of humanity and the maintenance of the sustenance of humanity in Asia compared to any other places was better. And that's the reason you have more population then. Wherever they had much more food, much more commodities, much more, existence, that's where you had much more population growth. So one more time to focus on this, and we can get out of it easily. Around 1.3 million years back, the existence of Homo sapiens, we have that in Asia. Now, there is one more theory coming up, and coming up in the sense of gaining much more popularity and acceptance among experts who deal with archaeology, who deal with the birth and rise of humanity in different places of Asia. And that theory is that Homo sapiens, the later stage human beings whose physical body and mental capabilities were closer to us, these people existed side by side with the people that we call Homo erectus. So although there is a big difference in the age, still what it says, Homo erectus lingered on on the ladder of survival. They did not just die out all of a sudden. So they lingered on to produce the Homo sapiens. Now, Homo sapiens, and that's the theory, is the Homo sapiens and Homo erectus lived side by side. So keep that in mind, and you can do your own research on it, in what place, in what area you have Homo erectus and Homo sapiens living side by side. But the main theory is that it happened much more in Southeast Asia rather than other places. It does not mean that other places did not have Homo erectus. I mean, somewhere in North China, northeastern part of China and other places, but the emphasis is much more on Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia a better place for humanity to live on. Let's go further down in the presentation. Then quite by late in the sense that compared to 1 million or 2 million or 5 million years, by 200,000 years ago, we get some racial differences, or some ethnic differences based on the structure of the face, the skull, who would have more hairs, facial hairs, or who would not have that much. And so here you can see by 200,000 years ago, in Asia itself, you see sort of, the differences sinking in the faces and the features and the sizes of the human beings. So I have for you two photos, two pictures, one a person from Pakistan, another from China. Now, the older gentleman from Pakistan, he could be from Pakistan, he could be anywhere in Afghanistan, he could be from Iran. But I know for a fact that he is a Pashtun, which is my own ethnicity. And most people in northwestern Pakistan and southeastern Afghanistan, that's the Pashtun area. That's, I mean, where you can, you know, fit him in that area. And the more you go to the Chinese part, even if you are not in China proper, there you get features, you know, becoming a little bit different from the gentleman from Pakistan, the Pashtun person. So these differences started close to around 200,000 years back, and compared to the birth of human beings or the Homo erectus or Homo sapien, this is sort of a recent phenomena. Let's move on further. The racial changes then becoming more and more, you know, distinctive. Although it took sort of evolutionary, you know, line, faces change within the same racial group, not just between, you know, the Mongolite group, which is predominantly the Chinese and East Asian people, or the Caucasoid group, which is predominantly Pakistan, Afghanistan, in Iran. But within the same racial group, you see changes coming along close to around 10,000 and 2000 BC, that is BC before Christ. And it happened because due to interbreeding by among different human beings, as well as environmental changes that happened, you know, at that time, and still continuing between the Chinese and the Korean, the Japanese. I mean, to the an average American or a European person, they may not look different, they might all look the same. But among themselves, the Chinese, the Korean, the Japanese, there is, you know, difference. And they can tell what the differences are, or those of us who live predominantly in Chinese or Korean or Japanese or people, we can tell the difference. But if you are not living, you know, for a long time with them, you cannot really tell the difference. They might all look the same to you. But there are, you know, differences between Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese. Now, these differences you can see also in India, where the largest stock would be Caucasian, Caucasoid. But you would see people living in the north would look very different from those who live in the south of India. And again, why? Because simply the geographical impact, the natural impact, the sun and the heat or the lack of it, or the cold environment. So all these, you know, have impact, especially on the color. The more you live and for a longer time in the colder climate, you know, the skin takes a sort of white color. Those people who live for a long time in the hot sun area like India, central India or southern India, definitely, you know, it will have impact on the color of the body. So people get darker, and that we know for a fact. So these changes, not only between the main dominant different racial groups, but within the same race we see those changes. You can see that in India, we can see that in Pakistan. The higher you go in elevation in northwestern Pakistan, you know, people look much more Caucasian. As you go down, the same people, they change a little bit of their color. As well as, you know, there is a difference even in sizes. Let's go further down in the presentation. The Paleolithic Age in Asia, that's a huge big period from 1 million to about 25,000 BC. That's a huge big period, and that's the period of Paleolithic, or what we call the Old Stone Age, in which human beings, they lived mostly like, you know, as animals did, hunting and gathering their food, but not making their food. So at this stage, human beings were much more hunter and gatherers, just like the animals. They just ate the food, consumed the food. So they were the consumers of food, but they were not the producers or maker of food. And Also, they were much more at the mercy of nature. Just like the animals, if they found nature or natural conditions, at the time, or natural forces overwhelming, they sought shelter wherever they could. So they would hide, and also the human beings had to face not only natural forces, natural disasters, natural elements, hot and cold, rain, and sun. They also had to face the wild animals, and more people could, depending on the place, they could be killed by wild animals than by, a wind or a typhoon. So these wild animals, although important later on in the life or the struggle for survival among human beings, they were at this point in the Paleolithic Age, they were not domesticated. So there wasn't any love labor lost between the animals and the human beings, no friendship between the animals and the human beings. And I say the animals because these were very important, as we can see it. Human beings have used animals for different purposes, not just for the food, but for the work. Supplementing the labor, human labor, animals were very important. Still they are important in, better part of the world, where labor is still not mechanized or motorized or not based on, these new gadgets like tractors and all that stuff. So animals very important, and in some places, people, they don't eat their, cow or ox or, water buffalo because they need it much more for work. So that's why sometimes they, I've seen people, they would take much more care of their animals, even, better than the human beings, because they know the worth of the living animal, that they, the function they perform in the local economy, in the, getting the food in the local area. Sometimes it can be very tough, and human being cannot do it. You have to apply the force of the animal, horsepower, so to speak, and then you can yank your food out of the terrain. So that's why the animal is very important. But at this stage, Paleolithic Age, they were not domesticated. So they could be danger to human beings, and human beings had to stay away from them. Let's move on. The Neolithic Age in Asia, there is, I must warn you, a long transitional period between the Paleolithic Age to Neolithic Age. And the Neolithic Age, somewhere around 10,000 BC to 5,000 BC. That's itself, a big time frame. But before that, before the Neolithic Age started, the Paleolithic Age took a longer period. The Neolithic Age was much more based on the New Stone Age, as we call it. It was based on settled agriculture. People could make food now. They were the makers and the producers of food as much as, of course, they were the consumers of food. But the main difference between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic Age is that at the time of the Paleolithic Age, people did not produce food. They just consumed it. Wherever they could find, they would go after it and eat it. So that's the Paleolithic Age. The main feature of that age is that it was the human beings, just like the animals, cruised around after food. Wherever they could find it, they would go after the food and eat it, and then, move on to another place when they exhausted one food supply in one area. They would go to another place, and there, they would do the same. Live there, eat the food, move on to another place, and if they remember the older place, they might come to it, after like a migratory bird or animal, they would come and they would have fresh supplies. So that was much more the case in the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic stage. But the difference and the greatness and the wonderful thing about the Neolithic Age is that human beings became the producers of their own food supplies. Now they could make food, not only just make food, but also they could make their shelters. And these were, as the two basic needs, and I think we talked about them, in some, maybe in the previous sessions. These two basic needs of food and shelter now could be attended to, and those problems and needs could be solved by the human beings living in a certain area. They could do that, and that is how started what we call the Neolithic Revolution, or the agriculture process, and the production of food and the making of shelter and the making of settled life that necessitated by the Neolithic Revolution agriculture. Now, also this was could be done not everywhere, only in certain places. Those places that had a lot of water, fresh water as well as a rich soil, the ground, and which could be easily, broken and plowed, and the seeds could be, put there and sown, and people could have a good life based on crops, based on the production of food. So this was not possible everywhere, and that is the reason only certain places on planet Earth could produce the early Neolithic settled agricultural communities or villages or settlements, as we call them. Now, in Asia itself, not everywhere, but only in those places where you had rivers. And there is sort of, I tell my students, wherever you have a river, there you have the rise of a culture, the rise of a civilization, the rise of a settled community based on agriculture. So in Southeast Asia was a far, far better place for the rise of agriculture and for the settlement of human beings and for the growth of population. So let's go into the presentation and see those areas. Asia was an agricultural paradise, as it is even now, and much more done traditionally. It had an ideal temperate zone, neither too hot nor too cold, perfect, ideal place. It had a lot of rich alluvial soil that could grow almost anything that naturally could be grown there, or the seeds, whatever the seeds were there, they could grow it. A lot of water that you have in Asia, a lot of rivers, river valleys and natural lakes that you have there. And there is one more thing, and that is, if you look at the natural sort of existence of these rivers on planet Earth, most of them happen to be in Asia. Most of them happen to be in Asia, and that's where you have them. Let's see some of these rivers in Asia. Number one, the great river, mighty river Indus, which is in Pakistan, and this river produced, its own civilization that is known after it, the Indus Valley civilization. The way it started from the northwestern part of Pakistan, I've been there. It's just a spectacular place that gives birth to this majestic river, the Indus River. Another great river, the Ganges, very popular river in India, and flows up to the east. It produced its own civilization, its own communities, people. Another great river, Mekong, that stretches throughout mainland Southeast Asia. It's another majestic river. Another river in China, the Yangtze River in South Central China. Without that, the Chinese civilization could not exist. And my favorite one, the Yellow River in northern part of China, and in between these two rivers, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south, you see the rise of the great Chinese culture and civilization. So keep in mind the rise of agriculture in Asia due to these wonderful resources that they had. Now, in Southeast, agriculture started first in Southeast Asia. That we know now because of the evidence that we have it, and just the simple fact that it was a wonderful place, an ideal place, especially North Vietnam, where you have the start of the late Neolithic settled agriculture in that part of North Vietnam. Why North Vietnam? We'll go into the detail a little bit later, but I can tell you because it's very close to South China. That's another, good place for agriculture. Another place was northern Thailand. A wonderful place, still this day, It produced bumper crops and domesticated a lot of animals up there in the north of Thailand. Some historians believe, archaeologists believe, that if agriculture in Asia had to start from a point, one given point, that given point could be somewhere in Philippines. And some people contest that sort of a big claim for Philippines, but there are scholars who believe that it had to start from somewhere, not everywhere, but from somewhere in a particular place. So that particular place could be Philippines. And there are other people, because everybody wants to be first, and all these great things, we were here first, or we produced this thing first, or we invented this thing first. I think we talked about that in the previous sessions, that terraced agriculture, a wonderful system that when you turn mountain into lush green fields, that system, that technology, that invention of turning mountains into fields and farms, which we call terraced agriculture, it started in Philippines. That's a claim of certain scholars, and now we see that terraced agriculture almost everywhere. We see it in China, we see that in Japan, we see that even in Pakistan, and a lot of remote places. But you have to have a mountain for that, or a higher ground. But every mountain cannot produce and does not produce terraced agriculture or farms and fields to do agriculture activity. These mountains, they cannot be very tough stone. They have to have a lot of soft soil. And they have to have water, natural water, and especially rainwater. And so you can find them much more in Philippines and Thailand and Vietnam and southern part of China rather than any other place. And sometimes these terraced agriculture communities, they suffer a lot, because if there is an earthquake, that whole mountain with a lot of soil and a lot of water, it can just crash down and bury the community that made it possible. So it happens quite often that mudslides that come from these mountains of terraced agriculture, because the soil is not that tough, and with a little bit of rain, and when it rains there, it's never a little bit of rain, it's a lot of rain. But that rain, if it rains for about 1 or 2 days, it softens further the soil and can crash the whole thing. So we call it mudslide, and the mudslide can bury communities and villages, and that has been in news lately, and that it has its own history. Mudslides and the killing of people, the communities that brought it upon themselves, so to speak. So only Southeast Asia could produce agriculture and maintain a bigger population, because this was an ideal place. Again, a lot of water and a wonderful rich soil. Let's move on. In agriculture in Southeast Asia, not only the place was wonderful, but already even before the rise of human beings, or before the coming of human beings in that place, nature had already supplies for people. Nature already had its own products to be consumed by the people of the Paleolithic or later on the Neolithic Age. So in Southeast Asia, what you have, these root crops, as great as anything can be, taro and yam, wonderful food. Living in Hawaii, I had much more good luck with taro, and I can easily eat it. Some people told me that they cannot, but I have much more good time with both taro and yam, and that is lucky you can get in Hawaii. So there are not just only taro and yam, but other great things that a tropical area produces. And boy, maybe try it, but try at your own risk. If you are not, your stomach is not used to it, it might, first give you trouble. Who knows? But I never had any trouble with it. So that's why I would really, encourage you to use it and try it, taro and yam, and how good they are. You later on tell me. Okay, let's see other crops that Southeast Asia had and naturally available. Beside the root crops, you have tree crops. And boy, you know, this presentation can water your mouth today. Look at all this great stuff: banana, breadfruit, coconut, eggplant, mango, and papaya. I had seen all of these except the breadfruit, and when I came to Hawaii, there I found it, you know, and I have still, you know, have to experiment with it to eat it and enjoy it. But the rest of it, you know, much more available in the rest of the world. Banana, and now you can have it in even in northern parts of the world, in continental area. So most of these tree crops, food, they were naturally available to people in Southeast Asia because these were the native plants or crops that lived there before the rise of the human beings. So here the point is that crops, fruits, especially fruits, whether root or tree, they pre-existed human beings. So it makes a, you know, a sort of a natural sense that before the rise of human beings or before the birth of human beings, there were already, you know, supplies of food waiting for them to come and, you know, consume them. So maybe that's, you know, nature, how it works itself. Before there was, you know, maybe nature knew they were going to be consumers, and consumer not just only human beings but also animals, and you know, the rest of the environment was full of food for the rise of humanity and animals. Let's move on into the presentation. Agriculture in Southwest Asia. That is a well-known established story that early human culture and civilization started in Mesopotamia, which was ancient Iraq, and the same Iraq based on the two great river system of the river Tigris and river Euphrates in modern day Iraq. Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, they produced, you know, Southwest Asia, one of the early cultures or civilizations of humanity. They also produced the first agriculture, you know, based settlements, Neolithic settlements, as early as 3000 BC. And some, you know, scholars claim that they could be as early as 5000 BC. So whatever the period, the historical line time, you can check that in books and encyclopedias and other places. But 3000 BC is a safe, you know, time period to say, especially in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, or Turkey. Mesopotamia could be a little bit early because of the great river system that it had. So agriculture in Southwest Asia, the first place, the first area of Asia that it produced the first civilization. And from there, Southwest Asia, it moved further east to modern day, you know, like India or China or Southeast Asia. So keep in mind, Southwest Asia, the point of origin of human beings and civilization, and then moving further along east, how people, you know, went there, or human beings, and how even these crops moved with them from Southwest to East Asia and Southeast Asia. Let's see further down what Southwest Asia, I'm sorry, what Southwest Asia produced: wheat, barley, millet, and citrus. And most of these crops, these are basically crops of continental area, that the terrain is usually tough, you know, water is not much available there, not as much in abundance as in other places like Southeast Asia. So wheat, barley, millet, and citrus, they don't need that much water, and so that's why these crops were produced in the northern tough terrain continental area of Southwest Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and Iraq. Also, these places produced urban centers, one of the earliest centers for business and trade routes like the Silk Road and so many other, you know, routes that they did business on, and they took commodities from point 1 to point B at that early stage as 3000 BC. Then the Inter-Asian crop exchange. That's another wonderful story about the history of the food in Asia, exchange of crops within Asia. From northwestern to southeastern Asia, we see the exchange of crops as well as human beings. So let's see what were those items that came from northwestern part of Asia to southeastern part of Asia. Wheat, barley, millet, they came from the continental part of Asia, northwestern Asia. And they went to southeastern Asia, and Southeast Asia in exchange gave the continental people of northwestern part of Asia, they gave them rice, they gave them taro, and they banana and yam. And if you look at these, the difference between these crops, you can easily see that these crops, they are different of course, but then the difference is based on the geography in which they were produced. Rice takes a lot of water. Wheat does not need that much water. Rice you can grow it, in the milder temperate zone of Southeast Asia and East Asia, but you cannot grow it in very tough places, very cold places. So that's why, the exchange of commodities, why one place produce one set and the other place produce another set of food, which is great, and you could easily exchange one, to the other or for the other. So keep in mind why these different, crops, because the different areas that they were produced, and they were produced naturally. At that time, technology could not be brought to produce everything as we can do it now. I think anybody, so many people can produce so many things out of season even. You can have tomato, in winter. I never heard of that. But when I came to United States, I had, tomatoes, and I like them, in winter, so many of them. And so, but back home you couldn't have, you had to have everything in its own season, and you had to wait for the mango to come, for banana to come, but now year round you can have, oranges, unbelievable. Go to these grocery stores, places, you can have oranges anywhere, anytime. Banana, I don't know how they do it, but they do it, and they make it available to you. Let's move on to the peoples of Southeast Asia and the migration that took place from South China and later from Tibet and India, and how they went and mixed with the pre-existing people of Southeast Asia. There is a sort of a system involved that I will talk about in a minute. So note down the migration of people from South China, which is still north, a little bit north compared to Southeast Asia, and how they mixed up with people who already existed there, including the Negritos. Island Southeast Asia, let's talk about that first. The Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines that constitute what is called the Island Southeast Asia, and they belong to one major group called the Malay group. And because of the Malay group, we call the whole area as the Malay archipelago, and Malay archipelago is that of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines. And most people, they share a lot of ethnic, physical, linguistic, and culture features. They have common affinities. They resemble very closely to each other. So for the physical, face or facial similarities are concerned. Language also in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines has better affinity and closeness compared to East Asia between Chinese or Koreans that we would talk about later on. Let's see the geographic area of the Malay archipelago, which is Malaysia and Indonesia and Philippines, as we talked about. This constitutes the Malay archipelago. The Malay group is dominant in Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. They belong to the same ethnic group. And this ethnic group also moved around out of this area and mixed up with other people further north as even Japan. Okay, let's see the mainland Southeast Asia. And now we're dividing Southeast Asia into two parts, island Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia. Mainland Southeast Asia would be Thailand, Myanmar, which was previously called Burma, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They constitute the mainland Southeast Asia. And let's see that area on the map. It is to the north of the Malay archipelago and to the south of China. That's sort of an easy recognition right there. This is mainland Southeast Asia, to the south of China and to the north of or northwest of Southeast Asia or the Malay archipelago. This area is very important. For one reason, because this area gave China a lot in terms of food, and so that's why it's very important place. And as I told you in the beginning of this presentation, that Vietnam, northern Vietnam and northern Thailand, they are believed to have started the agricultural beginning. So very important place. Mainland Southeast Asia, I'm not denying the importance of other places, but this is important in the sense that it produced some of the first major crops in Asia, and it also was the home to some of the first animals that we see now, so much in business and so much in work throughout Asia. So a highly important place. Another reason for mainland Southeast Asia to be important, it is just the meeting ground between China or the Mongolite Chinese group people and the Southeast Asian, the Malay group people. It's a mixture of both, and that's why it's sort of a bridge, between the Malay people and the Chinese people. And both people have their own influences in this area. So it's a meeting ground, playground for people, products, animals to go up further north and down south. Let's see the mainland Southeast Asia. Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. As I said, most of the people there in mainland Southeast Asia, they speak Chinese related languages because they, are on the border of South China. That's the reason. They also belong to, racially speaking, to that part of the world, the Chinese South. Although Thailand and Myanmar, they use the Indian script. So for writing is concerned, one can adopt any writing script, but the language still conforms to the mainland Southeast Asia, which is very much a Chinese-related linguistic group. Mainland Southeast Asia, people, the one that live there, mostly these are the immigrants from South and Southwest China. So the population, and hence the connection between mainland Southeast Asia and South China and southwestern China, because the people are the same people. They came from China and lived there long times ago. They must have displaced the pre-existing Malay people that lived there. But still, the Malay group is there, and the Malay influence is there in Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia. Let's see the Indo-Chinese Southeast Asia and how that worked. The geographical and the ethnic and the cultural relations between North Vietnam, Thailand, and southeastern China is just great. The ethnic, especially, and the cultural relations between these people. As I said, they constitute, they come from the same race, South China, and northern Vietnam and northern Thailand. Also, in Southeast Asia, you see a lot of transfer and exchange of commodities, not just of only human beings, going and coming back and forth, but you see a lot of exchange of commodities and as well as animals. Let's see chickens, pig, water buffalo, rice, root, and tree crops. These were taken from mainland Southeast Asia to southern China and eastern India. Unbelievable story of supplies going from Southeast Asia to China as well as to India. And the reason for these, these were first born and raised and grown and developed in Southeast Asia because of the ideal situation that you have there. Again, on the map, from Southeast Asia, the exchange of commodities and how they went there, of the products into different directions, going into South China and East India. East India on the left and South China, just to the north of it. It's a wonderful story of products going into China and India from Southeast Asia, an ideal place for almost everything right there. Now, what are some of the problems? Especially the problem of archaeology. We talked about so many great things, the food and the animals, the people there, but unfortunately, archaeological findings are not great. These are all perishable goods, especially the crops. And the human beings as well as the animals cannot, after death, cannot live for that long in the extreme humidity, and high temperature of that area and a lot of water that is there. So all this, heat, temperature and humidity and water, what they do, they break down organic remains. Human bones, animal bones, or for that reason, crops, these are perishable goods. So the archaeological evidence is lacking, not high as it could be in continental areas, but still, we can reconstruct the history of the place and the people. It's very Southeast Asia, very rich in agriculture and great in population, but poor in archaeological evidence that we know. Another group of people that, although they are not part of our History 241, but still I thought I should bring them and mention them, the Pacific Island people, the people of the Pacific Islands, Australasians, the Aborigines that we have in Australia, the Negritos, the Melanesians and the Micronesians and the Polynesians. So all these people, they inhabit and populate the islands in the Pacific Ocean. Wonderful cultures, beautiful cultures, unbelievable, spectacular, and and then on top of it, the cultural and the linguistic affinity that they have, that's just great and makes life much more peaceful in the islands. So although we are not going to talk about them in History 241. Later on, we would visit them in History 242 if you stay with us in History 242, the Asian Civilization Part 2. So let's move on further in the presentation, the prehistoric China. China, you see the South Tropical China that had an early start in agriculture, because that South Tropical China is very close to Southeast Asia, which gave them, settled agriculture and communities. So South and Tropical China, it had an early start for very good reason, because it had a very good interaction with the mainland Southeast Asia. So that's the major reason, because it was good for agriculture, naturally good. And then from there spread to North Continental China. So far the products are concerned, the production of agriculture is concerned, it started in the south of China and the tropical area of China, and then it moved to the continental northern part of China. That's what this whole theory is. And there it has, a lot of the archaeological evidence. Now, there is a very interesting theory that people and products, in what direction did they move? People moved from north to south, not just only in China, amazingly in other places also. People moving from north to south, not just only in China, but other places like in India and as well as in Europe. And products, they moved from south to north. I don't know who told them to do that, but you know, that's how a natural way of migration of people and products took place. One more time, keep in mind, people moving from north to south in China, in India and other places, but the products moving from south to north. And it makes sense because most products were produced in south. And let's see that putting in motion. People coming from north to south in China, because now we're talking of China, so that's why we focus on China, and the products moving from the south to the north. And you know, not only just it's good northern people living in the south, and once they found, you know, south was a better place to live in, and who doesn't want that, you know, so they came down, lived in south, enjoyed the south, the products, the agriculture, you know, abundance, and the food that they had, supplies naturally available. And then the same people also took these ideas, you know, from south to the north, and they took these crops with them, and you know, started life there. So that's how the theory works. People moving from the north to the south, and the products moving from the south to north. Now, northern continental China is a very arid place, semi-arid, and it has a lot of good plain area. A lot of plains with wonderful, you know, fertile soil that it has. Also rich with loess and the Yellow River valleys that you have in the north. It can produce, you know, its own bumper crops, and it did. And so much so that that place, the bumper crops there and the food that it produced, also people had to come up with some way to preserve them. And that's, you know, we're getting into another territory now. So the North continental China produced and preserved the naturally available native agricultural products as early as 4000 BC. So that's just about the time, you know, when a little later, in fact, not just about that time, but a little later than Mesopotamia and India. I still like, I don't know why, and there could be, you know, some sort of nationalism when people say, you know, we were first, we started this thing first. But the fact is that Mesopotamia, which is the modern day Iraq, you know, the valley and the great place between the two great rivers in Iraq, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, these two rivers produced the first human civilization. And as I said in the beginning or in the middle of the presentation, then civilization moving from there to different directions, and especially to the east, and that is towards Asia. So people in northern and continental China produce their own products, and then they preserve them in beautifully, you know, carved or made pottery. So let's go further down. Beside the products, people also produced, I mean, you know, they domesticated goats and sheep. There is, you know, not just only the plants. Human beings do live everywhere. But if you look at the animal distribution on planet Earth, goats and sheep, horse and cow, these are animals of the north. That is the continental area. Other animals belong to different, you know, areas, but especially water buffalo, you know, particularly water buffalo. That is an animal of the south, which has a lot of water. I mean, I've seen a lot of water buffaloes, you know, in the north also, but in the original schemes of things, just as certain plants, certain crops, whether root or tree crops or plain ground crops like rice, certain plants, just as certain plants had to grow only in certain, you know, climatic zone, south, tropical, rainforest, that sort of place. Also, animals did the same thing. Some animals much more available naturally in abundance in the south tropical area, that one group, and then there is the continental or the northern group animals. And just as we have differences between the crops, north and south, continental and tropical, there we have differences in the animals. And I don't want to, carry on this analogy to extreme, and that's why there is a difference, among human beings also. Those who live in the north, they look one way. Those who live in the south, they look another way. The continental people, different, very different. Their cultures, very different within the same country, like China or India for that reason. So continental people, northern people, they look different. They do things differently because of the nature and the geography that they have to face. And the southern tropical people, they, create their own culture in a different way. They eat different food. So that's how the difference is very natural among human beings, among plants, and among animals. Let's move on into presentation further down. The north and south, and I can tell you right now, look at this beautiful, two river systems, the Yangtze in the south and the Yellow River in the north. These two made possible the rise of civilization, the rise of humanity, culture, and bumper crops right there in the northeastern part of China. So, and it grew, in all directions. And this was the original homeland of the Chinese civilization, and from there it spread into different places. These two rivers, they remind me the rivers of Tigris and Euphrates. Majestic as they are, very beautiful, and although also, very powerful. And the north continental China, close to Xi'an, has a place called Banpo. And in that place, I've been to, not to Banpo, but to the area, closer to that area, and you can see throughout that area, a lot of production of millet, barley, and wheat, and now you can grow almost anything there, and a variety of rice that these people produce very early on, a variety of rice that did not need a lot of water. So that was just wonderful, a rice that did not need a lot of water, and it supplemented the naturally available native plants or products of millet and barley. Also, Banpo produced pottery, manufactured pottery to preserve the surplus of agriculture and other food commodities. That's again, need or necessity is the mother of invention. They had a lot of food, a lot of commodities, and they had to preserve it, and different ways of preserving, smaller like in parts, and bigger like in bigger stores. So Banpo, north continental China, produced, it became known for producing wonderful pottery. One is called the Yangshuo painted pottery. The other Longshan black pottery. Both are just wonderful, unbelievable. And the area is also known for some other wonderful stuff. Both styles emerged independent of West Asian influences, because the potteries, especially in East Asia, there is something to pottery or implements or, other instruments that we see in different places of the world. There is one thing that plants are natural, animals are natural, human beings also, natural. And human beings can move, with the animals, or the animal move with the human beings. That's possible. But pottery or products, implements, tools, these are very native, very specific to a geographic area. So different people produce different, items to use them in daily life, and that's why they give it to other people. Items can easily be transferred. Their ideas can be easily transferred. I give you an easy example in East Asia, that is China, Korea, and Japan. Whatever you had in Japan at one point, let's say 300 BC, there existed a pot, painted or not, or any implement, any tool instrument, 3300 BC, then you had the same thing close to about 400 or 500 BC in Korea. The same thing existed about 500 or 600 BC in China. So what it suggests, we found it in Japan, but it came from Korea. But we found it in Korea, but it also came from China. So there you see that with the timeline of the same item almost, although it changed from China to Korea, from Korea to Japan. And that's how it happened, in the rest of the world. But interestingly, in China, everything was produced by the Chinese on their own without any influence from outside. Just as Mesopotamia influenced people in Iran and the Iranian people influencing people in Central Asia, and from the Central Asia people influencing the people or the products or the items, from Central Asia to Pakistan and to India, that we don't see in China. The Chinese civilization is very unique to the geographical area, isolated as it is, to China. And because of isolation, that's why, the Chinese, whatever they produced, that was just their own, and they produced it on their own. So that's what we mean by that both styles of the pottery that the Chinese produced, they were independent of West Asian influences. Moving along, in Banpo and other similar places, cultures evolved what later on would be known as the Shang culture. The Shang culture lived around the time frame of 1700 to 1050 BC. That is the first, regular culture, or some people call it the Shang dynasty. In that area, they utilized the already existing cultures. So the Shang was not just a unique starting point. No, it was a developing point, and it was produced based on the already existing items that people produced in China. The Shang area, or the Shang period, at that time you also see the rise of the central authority of kings or emperors or rulers, whatever you call them. And also during this time you see the rise of literacy and building of cities. Now look at this. This is the bronze vase from the Shang dynasty, and could have been used for drinking purposes or whatever, but so beautiful, as early as between 1700 and 1000 BC. Some Europeans tended to say that no, there wasn't any such thing as the Shang dynasty or the Shang culture. But now with the help of archaeology, and especially in the north, as we dig more and produce, recover more items, Shang dynasty and the Shang culture becomes a historical reality. During the Shang period, the use of oracle bones, wonderful system, superstitions you may call it, but still wonderful system. These oracle bones, these were basically animal shoulders, animal shoulder blades or turtle shells, and the people would write on them questions or requests, and then they would heat the bones to crack over the written lines, and from the crack they would sort of interpret what was the meaning of the crack. So there was a sort of element of superstition, or there was they wanted the heavens to tell them whether whatever they were doing, whether that was good or not. So they would interpret or the future, divining the future, so to speak. And some of these Chinese characters that they used on these bones, still in use. And so the Chinese cultural influences, writing and all that stuff also went further to, further east to Korea and Japan. When it comes to the oracle bones, there you have sort of the historical evidence itself. One is the Chinese language that tells us how old this language is in the written form. I mean, this speech is of course very old, as any language could be, but the Chinese written form is, you know, as old as it can get. Very old, and amazingly, some of the characters are still in use that people used as early as 1700 years before Christ. Not many languages can claim that type of a, you know, historical background and that type of a old heritage or history as the Chinese language, script is based on the Chinese characters. Very old. There have been a lot, of course, a lot of changes, no question about that. As you know, human beings, they grow into civilization, as they, you know, they have more needs for more items, as they produce new inventions, they have to come up with new names. But amazingly, some of these names and some of these ideas are still used in the Shang, that were used in the Shang period, are still in business. So that's wonderful stuff about the wonderful, you know, thing about the oracle bones. Let's see the North China influence and how these influences went in what directions. Mostly in the east, and they went to Korea, and from Korea they went further to Japan, which you know, we would pick this theme in another time. How the Chinese civilization influenced its neighbors in the East, Korea and Japan. That would be a wonderful topic for another time as we go into Korea and as we go into Japan. So in a conclusion, sort of, let's see what we did. In today's presentation, we talked about the prehistoric times in Asia, or Asia in the prehistoric times. That is Asia before the rise of writing. We talked about the human origins in Asia. We also discussed the agriculture, the rise of agriculture, especially in Southeast Asia, and how, you know, people and products moved from one place to another place. I think we did a lot today, and hopefully we would continue into the next section. That would be session 4. And I hope we are getting out of geography and getting into something more, you know, abstract, like religion and philosophies, much more into the civilized time, based on writing, based on commerce, based on cities, you know, but agriculture would be still a dominant theme in Asia. Keep that in mind. The geography would be still a dominant theme in Asia. Also, the inventive mind of Asia, that is inventing things on its own and, you know, producing its own, wonderful items, and without any, you know, any help from anybody. So thank you very much for tuning in and listening and watching History 241, Asian Civilizations, and today's presentation was session 3. Please check WebCT as well as the assignment that might be coming up. Thank you very much.